Welcome, and thank you for joining me again as we continue through chapter 5 of the book of Proverbs. And I want to kind of revisit verse 5, which we really kind of ended on talking about yesterday, where Solomon makes a statement about being seduced and being drawn into things that are unethical or immoral. And he says of the seductress who draws people into things that her feet go down to death and her steps lead straight to the grave. And what he's really trying to focus on is really the destructive nature of sin, and especially the destructive nature of sexual immorality. In fact, Paul said in 1 Corinthians chapter 6, if you recall, he said, "Flee from sexual immorality. All other sins a person commits are outside of the body, but whoever sins sexually sins against his own body." In other words, it kind of begins to lead you into a downward spiral. So how does it affect me personally? How do I sin against my own body? Well, first and foremost, what it does is it breaks my fellowship with God. It has a spiritual impact because, as Isaiah said in Isaiah 59:2, he says, "Your iniquities have separated you from your God. Your sins have hidden his face from you so that he will not hear." And I know this in a very personal way because when I first got saved, I very quickly got compromised in my faith. I was a student at UC Berkeley, and I remember that there were things in my life that I knew were wrong, but I just simply gave myself permission to go ahead and engage in those things. And the first thing that hit me was there was an absence of the sense of God in my life. Now, I don't think that God had forsaken me, but I just didn't feel his presence. And I thought that was his problem. And it was only until God brought me to an awareness that really the reason I felt the way I did was because I had really kind of closed my ears to what he was saying. It wasn't that God wasn't speaking, but suddenly I wasn't listening because it got in the way of what I wanted to do. And so what Paul reminds us in 1 Corinthians 6 is that our bodies are the temple of the Holy Spirit. And when we engage in things that are contrary to that, especially sexual immorality, it defiles the temple of God. It profanes the temple of God. So in the same way, when we read in the Old Testament of kings like King Uriah, Azariah, who walked into the temple to offer incense on the altar, and he wasn't the priest. He didn't have the right. His body was struck with leprosy. He was tossed out of the temple and spent the rest of his life living in a hut, separated from everybody because he was unclean. And there was a fear that he would spread his disease to other people. Well, I'm not saying that it has to be that severe, but what it does tell us is that God does care about that. And I think that was a big deception for me. It was the kind of idea, well, it's natural, and God doesn't make a big deal about it, and I shouldn't feel guilty about it. But what it does actually, sexual immorality in particular, is it distorts God's design for sex and the holiness that's supposed to be there. In Hebrews, he says the marriage bed is sacred. It's a holy place. And God designed sexual relationships to be sacred within the context of marriage. Sexual immorality is basically an overt rejection of that divine design. And often what it does is it leads to kind of shame and guilt and a spiritual dullness and apathy in our life. In other words, we have many people who will say, well, I don't know, I was walking with God so closely and I felt his presence, but now I don't feel the Lord anymore. And my question is to ask them, who moved, you or God? Because I find that God isn't the one who ever moves, but it is us. And then we begin to ask him, so what is there in your life that you've given yourself permission to engage in that you know it shouldn't be there? And I find for a growing number of men and even a growing number of women, it's online pornography. I mean, I don't want to embarrass anybody. Thankfully, we can have this conversation privately. But it's amazing how people are saying, well, it's just entertainment or it's just a distraction. No, it's something that is putting a lie in front of your eyes and saying you can sin and not reap a consequence from it because it's online, or some other rationalization where you say, I can't help myself, or whatever the deal is. I mean, I'm sure you would have a long list of excuses. But until you stop giving yourself permission to believe something that's not true, you'll continue to believe it. Because what it does is it will only open further doors to further temptation. That's why it's interesting when we talk about especially pornography and the online pornography. What pornographers try to do is they try to get someone addicted at the age of 12 because they know if they can get them addicted at 12, they have them for the rest of their life. They're a lifetime consumer of their stuff. And that's the whole point, is they don't just stop with the simple introductory level stuff like any other drug or addiction, but they always have to keep on increasing the sensationalism of what they're showing. And that's why we wonder, how does somebody begin by looking at basically a topless woman, and suddenly some years later they're involved in all sorts of very perverse, crazy stuff that I don't even want to talk about? And we say, how did they get there? Well, they didn't get there overnight. The pedophile didn't become a pedophile one morning when he woke up. He started living for sensual stimulation, and he just kept on having to go for bigger doses and bigger doses and bigger doses until finally he had to go outside of the natural boundaries, even to the point of things like bestiality and all these other crazy things. So we need to understand it has huge implications. And of course, it's not limited just simply to our spiritual, because our spiritual basically affects every aspect of our life. It also affects us emotionally, psychologically. I mean, there's a degree of mental illness that begins to develop in a person's life where they feel so much guilt and shame because they know what they're doing is wrong, and they feel regret, and they're self-condemned because they know they're engaging in something that violates what are their basic sense of values and what is true and what is right. They know they're sinning against God. And that leads to broken bonds and attachments. You see, suddenly our ability to interact with our spouses in a healthy way is interfered with by this idea that we become one flesh when we get married is violated now, because we've invited someone, even if it's only in our own minds, who doesn't belong in the marriage bed. I'm no longer, as Solomon would later say, spend your life being enraptured with your bride's body and loving her. As he put it, I don't mean to embarrass anybody, but he literally said it. He said, let her breast satisfy you your entire life. And when you begin to incorporate visually, mentally, psychologically somebody else, you are inviting another person into the wedding bed. And as a result, the spouse may not even know they're there, but nonetheless, it becomes a conscious distraction. And it actually leads to difficulty, a kind of a sexual dysfunctionality amongst couples, where they no longer can perform in a loving and healthy and enjoyable way. It's like we begin to feel fragmented and emotionally drained. And that's where the confusion, when we begin to get confused about our identity, and we begin to have trouble trusting. I find people who cheat on their spouses don't trust their spouses not to cheat on them. It's just kind of the way a liar believes everybody is lying. And so it is that we begin to suffer not only a sense of our own worth because we know we're living a lie, we also begin to let the boundaries of our marriage and our home and our family be violated. Even our personal identity begins to suffer. And when you look at people who are struggling with gender confusion, I guarantee you that a large percentage of these people were sexually molested and are now struggling with it, because part of the idea of being molested, especially as a child, is that sometimes it's not painful, it's pleasurable. And that the fact that they find pleasure in something that they know is wrong intensifies their guilt. And that's when they begin to find gender confusion. I'm convinced that many people who have moved into the homosexual lifestyle have done so because they found pleasure on it, and it became so maddening that suddenly they said, well, I'm no longer identifying as a straight or heterosexual person. I'm identifying as a homosexual person. I was on a plane one time, sat down, and I was the last guy in the plane, just made the flight, and I plopped down in my seat, thankful to be there, and a young lady was sitting next to me, and she looked at me and she said, hi, what's your name? And I could tell she'd had a few drinks. And I said, Ken. She's, hi, Ken. I'm so-and-so. I'm a lesbian. That's what she came out of her mouth. And I go, and in one of those moments where God just gave me words, I just said, no, you aren't. What you are is you're a little girl who was hurt by men, and now you're looking for love, but in all the wrong places. And all of a sudden, tears are coming down her cheeks. And she said, "What do you do?" And I said, "I'm a pastor." And she said, "Yeah, you really are a pastor." And it led to an interesting conversation, because here was a young woman who had chosen to identify in a way that's totally unnatural, because she didn't know how to deal with the guilt and the shame that she felt on the inside. She was looking for intimacy in a safe place, and for her, men were no longer safe. And so we find these things are really confusing. But let me just hit on the last couple of things that are also consequential. Because not only do these things affect us spiritually, not only do these things affect us emotionally, but they can also affect us physically. I mean, the idea of sexually transmitted diseases or unwanted pregnancies, talking about things that complicate your life. I remember having a woman coming in for counseling after a service when I was on staff at Costa Mesa, and she had developed a venereal disease because her husband had been unfaithful to her and she didn't know it. And she's really in a great stage of crisis. Not only did he have this disease, but now he had given it to her. And then with that, there comes the physical disorders that come because of the distress and the depression that follows it, and often the destruction of relationships and all the trauma that creates for us emotionally, and how that affects us physically. And then last of all, it can begin to launch us onto addictive patterns of behavior, promiscuity, pornography, all sorts of sexual kinds of sin that become compulsive, that become addictive. In fact, they have the effect, they start rewiring our brain so that we no longer have the ability to even control ourselves. Basically, it's this, there's an underlying truth here. All sin is toxic, but especially sexual sin. All sin is toxic, but especially sexual sin. And the word toxic means it's poisonous, and over time it will kill you. We'll move on to the next passage. We'll talk tomorrow about verse 6. God bless you.